On the morning of March 7, 1983, a maintenance worker at Sheremetyevo International Airport noticed something unusual about the hydraulic fluid reservoir on an Aeroflot Tupolev 154 aircraft. The plane had just completed a routine overnight flight from New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport, and standard protocol required a complete systems check before the aircraft could be cleared for its next scheduled departure to East Berlin later that afternoon. The worker, whose name was Viktor Leonidovich Sokolov, had been employed by Aeroflot for 16 years. He was 42 years old, methodical in his approach to aircraft maintenance, and known among his colleagues for his attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. He had worked on Soviet commercial aircraft since 1967, first as an apprentice under his father, who had been a flight engineer during the Great Patriotic War, and then as a fully certified mechanic, specializing in hydraulic systems and landing gear assemblies. Viktor arrived at his station at Sheremetyevo at 5:30 in the morning, as he did every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday, when he was assigned to the International Arrivals Maintenance Bay. The Tupolev 154, designated as flight number SU-316 from New York, had landed at 3:47 that morning, approximately 18 minutes behind schedule due to headwinds over the North Atlantic. The aircraft had been towed to Bay 7, where Viktor and two other mechanics were responsible for conducting the post-flight inspection before the plane could be certified airworthy for its next departure. The hydraulic fluid reservoir was located in the aft equipment bay, accessible through a panel beneath the tail section of the aircraft. Viktor had inspected thousands of these reservoirs over his career, and he knew exactly what normal looked like. The fluid level should be between the minimum and maximum marks etched into the transparent sight glass. The fluid itself should be a consistent reddish-amber color, clear and free of any contamination or particulate matter. The cap should be sealed tightly with the safety wire intact and showing no signs of tampering. What Viktor found that morning was a reservoir that appeared normal at first glance. The fluid level was appropriate, the color seemed correct, the cap was sealed, but something about the safety wire caught his attention. It was installed correctly, threaded through the proper holes in the cap assembly, and twisted in the standard manner. But the wire itself looked newer than it should have been. The aircraft had undergone its last major maintenance cycle 43 flight hours earlier, and the safety wire installed during that procedure should have shown signs of oxidation and wear consistent with that time frame. This wire looked fresh, as if it had been installed within the past few days. Viktor stood there for several minutes, holding his flashlight at different angles, examining the wire and the cap assembly. He could have dismissed it. He could have signed off on the inspection and moved on to the next item on his checklist. Maintenance schedules at Sheremetyevo were demanding, and there was always pressure to complete inspections quickly and efficiently to keep aircraft moving through the system. But Viktor had been trained by his father to never ignore an instinct when it came to aircraft safety, and something about this hydraulic reservoir was triggering an instinct he couldn't quite articulate. He removed the cap carefully, breaking the safety wire and setting it aside. He used a clean probe to check the fluid consistency, drawing a small sample and examining it against a white background under his work light. The fluid appeared normal. He checked the filter screen inside the reservoir neck, looking for any debris or contamination. Nothing unusual. He replaced the cap, installed fresh safety wire, and documented the inspection in his maintenance log, noting that he had found and replaced questionable safety wire as a precautionary measure. But the nagging feeling remained. Viktor had worked on enough international flights to know that Aeroflot aircraft operating routes to the United States was subject to additional security protocols. The aircraft were kept under constant surveillance when on the ground at American airports. Soviet flight crews were restricted in their movements, and required to remain with their aircraft or in designated crew areas at all times. The idea that someone had accessed the hydraulic reservoir of a Soviet commercial aircraft at JFK Airport was theoretically impossible given the security measures in place. Yet the evidence of fresh safety wire suggested that someone had opened that reservoir recently, and if not in New York, then when and where and why. Victor finished his inspection of the Tupolev 154 at approximately 7:15 that morning and signed the maintenance release form, certifying the aircraft as airworthy for its next scheduled flight. But before leaving the hangar, he made a decision that would eventually expose one of the Central Intelligence Agency's most successful operations against Soviet commercial aviation. He went to the maintenance supervisor's office and filed a deviation report, a formal documentation of an anomaly that didn't necessarily indicate a safety issue but warranted further investigation. The report noted the discrepancy in the safety wire condition and recommended that hydraulic fluid samples be sent to the laboratory for detailed analysis. The maintenance supervisor, a man named Grigory Mikhailovich Petrov, read Victor's report and made a note in the aircraft's permanent maintenance file. Under normal circumstances, such a minor deviation would have been reviewed during the next scheduled maintenance cycle and likely dismissed as a paperwork error or a misidentification by the reporting mechanic. But Grigory had received a classified directive 3 weeks earlier from Aeroflot's security department, a memo that had been distributed to all senior maintenance personnel at Sheremetyevo and Domodedovo airports. The directive, marked for official use only and signed by the deputy director of Aeroflot's Counterintelligence liaison office, instructed maintenance supervisors to report any unexplained anomalies observed on aircraft operating international routes, particularly flights to and from the United States, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. The directive didn't provide specific details about what kind of anomalies to look for. It simply stated that there was reason to believe hostile intelligence services might be attempting to conduct technical reconnaissance operations against Soviet commercial aircraft, and that all maintenance personnel should exercise heightened vigilance and report anything that seemed inconsistent with normal operating procedures. Grigory hadn't thought much about the directive when he first received it. Such memos were common enough in Soviet aviation, part of the perpetual state of security consciousness that defined life in any organization connected to state transportation infrastructure. But Viktor Sokolov's deviation report about the hydraulic reservoir and the fresh safety wire fit precisely the kind of unexplained anomaly the directive had described. Grigory picked up the secure telephone on his desk and dialed the extension for Aeroflot security. The call was answered after 2 rings by an officer named Major Yevgeny Borisovich Volkov, a career KGB officer who had been assigned to Aeroflot's counterintelligence section in 1979. Grigory explained the situation, reading directly from Victor's deviation report and providing the aircraft registration number, the flight number, and the date and time of the inspection. Major Volkov listened without interrupting, asked 3 specific questions about the location of the hydraulic reservoir, the accessibility of that part of the aircraft, and whether any other anomalies had been noted during the inspection, and then thanked Grigory for the report and told him that someone would follow up within 24 hours. Major Volkov hung up the phone and sat at his desk for several minutes, reviewing notes he had compiled over the previous 18 months. The KGB's second chief directorate, responsible for counterintelligence operations within Soviet territory, had been investigating reports of possible American technical intelligence operations targeting Soviet commercial aviation since early 1982. The investigation had been triggered by a defector, a low-level CIA technical officer who had walked into the Soviet embassy in Mexico City in January of 1982 and offered information about ongoing operations in exchange for asylum and financial compensation. The defector's information had been fragmented and incomplete, the kind of intelligence that required extensive verification before it could be acted upon with confidence. But one detail he had provided was specific enough to warrant serious attention. He claimed that the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology had developed a program to install covert monitoring devices on Soviet aircraft during their layovers at Western airports. The devices, according to the defector, were designed to intercept and record cockpit communications, navigation data, and potentially classified conversations among Soviet flight crews and passengers who might include diplomatic personnel, military officers, or intelligence operatives traveling undercover. The program, if it existed, represented a significant intelligence collection opportunity for the Americans. Aeroflot operated regular scheduled flights to more than 20 cities in Western Europe and North America, and the aircraft carried a mix of ordinary Soviet citizens traveling for approved purposes, as well as officials whose conversations might contain valuable information about Soviet military capabilities, economic planning, political developments, or intelligence operations. The ability to monitor those conversations covertly without the knowledge of Soviet security services would provide the CIA with a continuous stream of intelligence that would be difficult to obtain through traditional human source operations or signals intelligence collection. Major Volkov had been tasked with determining whether the defector's claims were credible and, if so, identifying which aircraft might be compromised and how the monitoring devices were being installed. The investigation had proceeded slowly over the past 14 months, constrained by the need to avoid alerting Western intelligence services that the Soviets were aware of a potential operation, and by the technical challenges of detecting devices that were specifically designed to be undetectable. Volkov and his team had conducted discreet inspections of several Aeroflot aircraft that had recently returned from flights to the United States and Western Europe, focusing on areas where monitoring devices might plausibly be installed: communication equipment bays, cockpit instrument panels, passenger cabin overhead compartments, and various accessible points in the fuselage and tail sections. But the inspections had revealed nothing conclusive, no obvious signs of tampering, no unexplained components, no anomalies that couldn't be attributed to normal maintenance activities or manufacturing variations. Viktor Sokolov's deviation report was the first concrete indication that something unusual might be occurring. The fresh safety wire on the hydraulic reservoir cap suggested that someone had accessed that compartment recently, and the timing, immediately after an overnight flight from New York, raised the possibility that the access had occurred at JFK Airport. Volkov made 2 phone calls that afternoon. The first was to the KGB's Technical Analysis Laboratory at Yasenevo, requesting an expedited analysis of the hydraulic fluid sample from the Tupolev 154. The second was to the chief of the Second Chief Directorate's American Operations Section, reporting the deviation and requesting authorization to conduct a comprehensive technical inspection of the aircraft. The authorization came through within 6 hours, at 11:30 that evening, long after the Tupolev 154 had departed for East Berlin and then returned to Sheremetyevo. A team of 8 KGB technical specialists arrived at the maintenance hangar. The aircraft was towed into a secure bay, and the inspection began shortly after midnight. The specialists worked methodically, using detection equipment that included metal detectors calibrated to identify non-standard components, RF spectrum analyzers to detect any electronic emissions, X-ray imaging devices to examine internal structures without disassembly, and ultraviolet light sources to reveal fingerprints or chemical residues that might indicate recent human contact with surfaces that were normally untouched except during scheduled maintenance. The inspection continued through the night and into the following morning. By 8 o'clock on March 8th, the team had completed their examination of the hydraulic equipment bay and had moved on to other sections of the aircraft. At approximately 10:15, one of the specialists, a senior technician named Lieutenant Colonel Anatoly Ivanovich Krasikov, called Major Volkov over to the aft equipment compartment where he had been conducting X-ray scans of the avionics mounting racks. Krasikov pointed to a monitor displaying the X-ray image of a junction box that housed connections for the aircraft's intercom system. The image showed what appeared to be an additional circuit board that wasn't part of the original equipment design, a small rectangular component approximately 4 centimeters by 6 centimeters, mounted inside the junction box and connected to the intercom wiring through leads that had been spliced into the existing cables. Volkov examined the image carefully, comparing it to technical diagrams of the junction box that Krasikov had brought from the Tupolev Design Bureau archives. The additional circuit board was definitely not part of the standard configuration. Its presence suggested either an unauthorized modification installed during manufacture, which seemed unlikely given the rigorous quality control procedures at Soviet aircraft factories, or a covert installation performed at some point after the aircraft entered service. The junction box was located in an equipment bay that was accessible only by removing several access panels, a task that would require tools, time, and familiarity with the aircraft's internal layout. It was not the kind of location that could be accessed quickly or casually. The decision was made to remove the circuit board for detailed analysis. Lieutenant Colonel Krasikov and another specialist carefully disassembled the junction box, photographing each step of the process and documenting the exact configuration of the wiring and the mounting of the unauthorized component. The circuit board was removed intact and placed in an anti-static container for transport to the laboratory at Yasenevo. The junction box was reassembled with the unauthorized component removed, and the aircraft was returned to service with a notation in its maintenance file indicating that non-standard equipment had been discovered and removed during a security inspection. The circuit board arrived at the Yasenevo laboratory at 1400 hours on March 8th. The analysis began immediately, conducted by a team of engineers and electronics specialists who had experience with captured Western intelligence collection devices. The initial examination revealed that the circuit board was a sophisticated piece of miniaturized electronics, far more advanced than anything produced by Soviet industry at that time. The components were Western-made, primarily American, with manufacturing date codes indicating production in late 1981 and early 1982. The board included a microphone element, an analog-to-digital converter, a memory chip capable of storing approximately 40 minutes of audio data, a timer circuit that appeared to control recording intervals, and a small battery pack designed to power the device for an estimated operational period of 90 to 120 days. The device's function was clear. It was designed to intercept and record conversations transmitted through the aircraft's intercom system, which included cockpit communications between flight crew members, announcements to passengers, and communications between flight attendants and the cockpit. The recordings would be stored in the device's memory until the device could be retrieved, presumably during a subsequent layover at a Western airport, at which point the recorded data would be extracted and the device's memory would be reset for another collection cycle. The technical analysis also revealed how the device had been designed to avoid detection. It drew minimal power, reducing the risk of detection through electrical load monitoring. It generated no radio frequency emissions, eliminating the possibility of detection through RF scanning. Its physical size and mounting location made it nearly impossible to discover during routine maintenance procedures, and its installation required only basic tools and approximately 15 to 20 minutes of uninterrupted access to the equipment bay, a time frame that was plausible during an aircraft's layover at a Western airport if the installation team could bypass or distract security personnel. Major Volkov received the preliminary analysis report on the evening of March 9th. The report confirmed that the device was almost certainly of American origin, likely produced by or for the Central Intelligence Agency's Directorate of Science and Technology, and that its installation on the Tupolev 154 had occurred at some point during the aircraft's recent operations to Western airports. The report also noted that the device appeared to be part of a standardized program, suggesting that similar devices might be installed on other Aeroflot aircraft operating international routes. The implications were significant enough that Volkov drafted an immediate report for transmission to KGB headquarters and to the Central Committee's Administrative Organs Department, which oversaw security matters affecting Soviet government operations. Over the next 2 weeks, Major Volkov coordinated an expanded inspection program targeting all Aeroflot aircraft that had operated flights to the United States, Canada, and Western Europe within the previous 6 months. The inspections were conducted discreetly during routine maintenance cycles to avoid alerting Western intelligence services that the Soviets had discovered the monitoring devices. By March 25, 1983, KGB technical teams had identified and removed similar devices from 11 additional Aeroflot aircraft. The devices were found in various locations: equipment bays, avionics compartments, overhead storage areas in passenger cabins, and in one case inside a cargo hold access panel. All of the devices followed similar design principles: miniaturized electronics, memory storage, timer-controlled activation, and passive operation that generated no detectable emissions. The discovery triggered an immediate counterintelligence response. The KGB launched an investigation to determine how CIA operatives were gaining access to Aeroflot aircraft at Western airports, where security was supposed to be maintained by Soviet personnel who accompanied the aircraft throughout their layovers. The investigation revealed a troubling pattern. At several airports, including JFK in New York, Dulles in Washington, Charles de Gaulle in Paris, and Heathrow in London, airport maintenance contractors had been providing services to Aeroflot aircraft under commercial agreements that had been negotiated years earlier. These contractors, all of them Western companies with reputations for reliable service, had been authorized to perform specific maintenance tasks such as refueling, tire inspections, and minor repairs under the supervision of Soviet flight engineers. The KGB's investigation determined that at least 3 of these contractors had been penetrated by Western intelligence services, either through recruitment of individual employees who had access to aircraft, or through the establishment of front companies that existed solely to provide cover for intelligence collection operations. The contractors' employees, some of whom were likely CIA case officers or technical operatives working undercover, had been able to gain access to Aeroflot aircraft during layovers by presenting legitimate maintenance credentials and work orders that appeared to authorize their presence. Soviet flight engineers, who were responsible for supervising all maintenance activities, had been unable to monitor every action taken by contractor personnel, particularly when multiple maintenance tasks were being performed simultaneously in different areas of the aircraft. The CIA's operational method had been elegant in its simplicity. Technical operatives would arrive at the aircraft with legitimate maintenance paperwork, perform their assigned tasks, and then, while flight engineers were distracted or focused on other activities, would install monitoring devices in pre-selected locations. The installation took only minutes. The devices were designed to be installed with minimal tools and could be placed in position and secured using adhesive backing or simple mechanical fasteners. Once installed, the devices were virtually undetectable without specialized inspection equipment, and they would remain in place collecting audio data until they were retrieved during a subsequent visit. The retrieval process was equally straightforward. On subsequent layovers, CIA operatives would again access the aircraft under the guise of performing routine maintenance, locate the monitoring device, extract the recorded data by connecting a portable reader to the device's data port, reset the device's memory, and replace the device for continued collection. The entire retrieval and reset process took less than 5 minutes, and it could be conducted without leaving any visible evidence that the device had been accessed. The KGB's investigation also revealed that the monitoring program had been operational for at least 2 years, possibly longer. Analysis of maintenance records and flight schedules suggested that the first devices might have been installed in late 1980 or early 1981, coinciding with a period when several Western maintenance contractors had been awarded new service agreements with Aeroflot. During that time, the CIA had collected an unknown but potentially significant volume of audio recordings from Soviet flight crews, passengers, and officials who had traveled on compromised aircraft. The intelligence value of those recordings was difficult to quantify, but it was almost certainly substantial. Soviet flight crews were trained to maintain operational security and to avoid discussing sensitive information over aircraft intercom systems. But the reality of human behavior during long international flights meant that conversations inevitably drifted into topics that might be of interest to Western intelligence analysts. Crew members discussed their personal lives, their opinions about political developments, their observations about conditions in the cities they visited. Passengers, particularly officials traveling on government business, sometimes spoke carelessly, assuming that conversations in the passenger cabin of a Soviet aircraft were secure from foreign surveillance. The KGB's response to the discovery was multifaceted. First, all Western maintenance contractors were immediately terminated from service agreements with Aeroflot, effective April 1, 1983. All maintenance activities at Western airports would henceforth be performed exclusively by Soviet personnel who traveled with the aircraft or by Soviet technicians permanently stationed at major foreign airports. Second, all Aeroflot aircraft operating international routes were subjected to comprehensive technical inspections to identify and remove any remaining monitoring devices. By mid-April, a total of 19 devices had been found and removed, and no additional devices were discovered during subsequent inspections, suggesting that the KGB had successfully identified the full extent of the compromise. Third, the KGB initiated a damage assessment to determine what intelligence might have been collected through the monitoring program and what operational or strategic consequences might result from that collection. The assessment was complicated by the fact that the Soviets had no way of knowing exactly which conversations had been recorded, when those recordings had been made, or what specific information had been captured. The assessment team had to work backward from flight manifests, crew rosters, and passenger lists to identify individuals who might have traveled on compromised aircraft and whose conversations might have contained sensitive information. The process was time-consuming and imprecise, but it eventually produced a classified report that estimated the CIA had potentially collected intelligence on Soviet military capabilities, diplomatic activities, economic planning discussions, and the identities and travel patterns of intelligence officers operating under diplomatic or commercial cover. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly from a counterintelligence perspective, the KGB launched an operation to identify and neutralize the CIA operatives who had been involved in installing and servicing the monitoring devices. The operation focused on Western maintenance contractors who had been providing services to Aeroflot at JFK, Dulles, Charles de Gaulle, and Heathrow airports. KGB officers posing as Soviet trade representatives and aviation officials conducted inquiries with airport authorities and maintenance companies, seeking information about contractor employees who had worked on Aeroflot aircraft during specific timeframes. Photographs taken by Soviet flight engineers during layovers were analyzed to identify faces and physical descriptions of contractor personnel who had been present during maintenance activities. Travel records, employment histories, and financial backgrounds were investigated for individuals who had worked for the contractors, looking for patterns that might indicate intelligence affiliation or recruitment. The investigation produced mixed results. Several individuals were identified as persons of interest, including 2 employees of a maintenance contractor at JFK who had both started working for the company in early 1981, shortly before the monitoring devices began appearing on Aeroflot aircraft. Both men had prior military experience, one in the United States Air Force and the other in the Navy, and both had access to Aeroflot aircraft during layovers. But neither could be definitively linked to the CIA without more concrete evidence. and the KGB was unwilling to take overt action that might expose Soviet knowledge of the monitoring program and potentially compromise future counterintelligence operations. By late summer of 1983, the immediate crisis had passed. The monitoring devices had been removed, the security vulnerabilities had been addressed, and Aeroflot had implemented new procedures to prevent similar compromises in the future. But the long-term implications of the discovery continued to reverberate through Soviet intelligence and security organizations. The incident demonstrated that Western intelligence services, particularly the CIA, were willing and able to conduct sophisticated technical operations against Soviet state assets in foreign territory, exploiting commercial relationships and routine maintenance activities to gain access to intelligence collection opportunities. It also highlighted the limitations of Soviet security measures when operating in hostile environments, where even carefully supervised activities could be compromised by determined and technically skilled adversaries. For Viktor Sokolov, the mechanic whose observation had initiated the investigation, life returned to normal with surprising speed. He was never told the full details of what his deviation report had uncovered. Major Volkov met with him briefly in late March, thanked him for his attention to detail, and encouraged him to continue reporting any anomalies he observed during maintenance inspections. Victor received a commendation letter from Aeroflot's Chief of Maintenance Operations and a small bonus payment that amounted to approximately 1 month's additional salary. He continued working at Sheremetyevo, inspecting aircraft and filing deviation reports when he noticed things that seemed inconsistent with normal operations. He retired in 1996 at the age of 55 after 34 years of service, and he spent his final years living in a small apartment in Khimki, occasionally visiting the airport to watch aircraft take off and land, remembering a career spent ensuring that Soviet passengers and crews could travel safely through a world that was more dangerous and more complicated than most of them ever realized. The CIA's monitoring program, known within the agency as Operation Aeroflot Echo, was officially terminated in May of 1983 after the agency's Moscow station reported indications that Soviet security services had become aware of the operation's existence. The decision to terminate was based on the assessment that continued operations would risk exposure of additional assets and methods, and that the intelligence collection value no longer justified the operational security risks. The devices that had been installed on Aeroflot aircraft were written off as operational losses, and the case officers and technical operatives who had participated in the program were reassigned to other duties. No official acknowledgement of the program's existence was ever made, and documents related to Aeroflot Echo remained classified at the highest levels of secrecy for decades after the Cold War ended. In the broader context of Cold War intelligence operations, the monitoring program represented both a success and a failure for American intelligence. The program had successfully collected 2 years of audio recordings from Soviet commercial aircraft, providing insights into Soviet aviation operations, military deployments, diplomatic activities, and the personal opinions and behaviors of Soviet officials traveling abroad. But the program had also been discovered and dismantled before it could achieve its full intelligence collection potential, and the discovery had prompted Soviet security services to implement enhanced counterintelligence measures that made future technical operations more difficult and more dangerous. The program's exposure also contributed to a general erosion of trust between Soviet and Western aviation authorities, complicating negotiations over international flight routes, safety standards, and commercial agreements that had been difficult enough to manage even under the best of circumstances. The story of how a single maintenance worker at Sheremetyevo Airport uncovered a CIA spy operation serves as a reminder that intelligence operations, no matter how carefully planned and technically sophisticated, are ultimately vulnerable to human observation and human error. Viktor Sokolov had no training in counterintelligence. He had no reason to suspect that American intelligence operatives were installing monitoring devices on Soviet aircraft. He simply noticed that a safety wire looked newer than it should have been, and he decided that the discrepancy was worth reporting to his supervisor. That decision, made on a cold March morning in 1983, set in motion a chain of events that exposed a multi-million-dollar intelligence program and forced the CIA to abandon one of its most productive technical collection operations against Soviet targets. The incident also illustrated the perpetual tension between security and operational efficiency that characterized intelligence operations during the Cold War. The CIA had developed an elegant method for collecting intelligence from Soviet aircraft, exploiting routine maintenance activities and commercial relationships to gain access to high-value targets. But the method required repeated access to the aircraft, and repeated access created repeated opportunities for observation, detection, and discovery. The longer the operation continued, the greater the risk that someone would notice something unusual, ask questions, and trigger an investigation that would unravel the entire program. In the end, it wasn't sophisticated counterintelligence tradecraft that exposed Operation Aeroflot Echo. It was a conscientious mechanic who understood that fresh safety wire on a hydraulic reservoir cap was inconsistent with the maintenance history of the aircraft he was inspecting, and who cared enough about his work to document the discrepancy in a deviation report that most people would have dismissed as bureaucratic paperwork.